Okay, welcome back. Let's get started for today. We are at the midpoint of the term here at week number 5, so we're definitely moving right along. This week, we'll be moving on to talk about how we are able to communicate health and science issues to the public using a variety of channels, including media and so on. Next week, of course, will be our health disparities presentations. So we have those coming up to look forward to and to plan on. So I want to give a few reminders related to stuff in the course as we go into that. Also, I will have your annotated bibliographies graded by the end of the week. I'm shooting for having them ready for you by Wednesday, but at the latest, I'll have them ready by the end of the week. And what I've noticed so far, things are looking really solid. I really like the defined and focused topics that you all are interested in. And I think that some of the work that you all have found so far will be directly helpful as you prepare for your presentation next week, if you're choosing the same topic. So in getting started for today, I just want to give you a few minutes, and you do not need to turn this in for your attendance. But I'd just like you to have the opportunity, if you'd like to review the rubric and guidelines for the presentation, knowing that that's starting next week. And also just to do a check-in with yourself, that you have at this stage ideally identified a topic and issue that you're planning on for your health disparities presentation. So the topic could be the health problem, right? For instance, the topic could be cancer, and the issue could be that cancer is disproportionately less cared for or supported by people of color, right? Or maybe the topic is mental illness and the way that mental illness is not understood or supported in the same way with women. So there's a lot of different examples here that you could draw from for that presentation, but start to think a little bit about how you're going to develop and explore it. And then I also encourage you, if you benefit from a timeline or calendar, to start to think about one for yourself, highlighting what you intend to complete at what stage, knowing that you will be presenting either next Monday or next Wednesday. Question came up regarding turning in the outline and slides. So I am asking you to turn in the outline and slides prior to your presentation, right? So turning it in, the slides in ahead of time, let me pull them up for your presentation. And then the outline, right, is for me to see as I'm following along to make sure you're kind of following a plan. I also recommend, as I've mentioned before, for you to print out a copy, or if you have a device with you, access through your device, the outline. Since it's a slightly longer presentation, 6 to 8 minutes, having the outline to draw from, rather than having to like memorize and get everything down word for word, can be a pretty big lifeline, right? You know, based on the outline, what to talk about next, and you can jog your memory as you're working through it. So just take a little bit of time to think about and plan out between today and your presentation date, what things will look like. If you would like to send me a draft or outline in advance, I'm happy to look at that. I would just ask that you get that to me at least a couple days before your presentation. So if you're presenting on Monday, that you get it to me by Friday. And if you're presenting on Wednesday, that you get it to me by Monday. Yeah, Garrett? Full paragraphs or bullet points? Bullet points is fine. Do try to use the full sentences for the bullet points, but it should just be kind of major points that guide your presentation. Yeah, about a sentence long is a good way to structure the outline. That way, it gives you just enough to jog your memory. So I'll invite you to continue to think about this during class today. Again, I'm not asking you to turn this in, but I do think it's useful just to give yourself some time to plan out how you're hoping to complete this assignment. I'm a big fan of the working backwards strategy, right? Thinking about the due date or the presentation date and thinking, okay, 2 days prior to that, what do I need to do? A week prior, what do I need to do? And so on. I think that helps assignments feel a lot less scary. And again, I think this will be a great opportunity to hear some of the topics and areas that you all feel passionate about. And this is not about, perfect public speaking skills or anything like that. It's a chance for you to share what it is that you're working on and that you're really interested in. So that's kind of what to expect as we get into next week. And again, you can refer back to that presentation schedule on Canvas for the date, and we'll go down the list in order. Again, I'll still be taking attendance for the day that you're not presenting, and I encourage you to attend so that we can hear what other folks in the class are working on and have the chance to chat about that together. So moving back from last week, we were talking about the way in which we use health and science communication online, right? We spent a lot of time last Monday talking about how we use e-health, mHealth, telemedicine, and ways of using virtual appointments to manage health. And then we spent a lot of time on Wednesday talking about misinformation, how to identify false and fraudulent information online, talking about COVID-19 and the ways that health and science information is shared using those channels, and also some of the ways that we can use online channels just to get more information about health, right? And so while we spent a lot of time last week talking about health communication online, we'll be shifting gears this week to talk about how experts in health and science related issues convey and share their messages to the public, right? The idea that if there is important information, whether it is about a campaign or it's a pandemic or a major issue impacting a larger audience, that health experts and people who have some sort of stake in communication have this incentive to explain that information. So we'll be taking kind of a mass communication approach to understanding and engaging with some of these topics. So we'll understand the idea of what it means to convey and talk about health to the public. Thinking about media's role in communicating to that larger public. We'll also spend some time this week looking at media representation of health and science too, right? For instance, the use of fiction and things such as television and film that play a really big role in how we understand and think about health and science related issues, especially surrounding things related to mental illness, as you'll notice from one of the readings on Wednesday. And then how media construct messages about health. So there's a lot of reasons why we should care about these issues and why health and science to the public is important. You might be thinking about whether or not you see yourself as moving forward in a career related to health. One of them is the idea that public communication is about how we reach a larger audience, right? It goes back to something like giving a speech, although we see that a lot less often. You might see a seminar or presentation or something similar, right? Such as the use of a webinar to share health information. But we also see the use of campaigns that convey that information. And so as you're thinking about your presentation for next week, you might be thinking about how, when you're posing a communication strategy to reach a population or to support a population that disproportionately experiences a health issue, how public communication strategies could help, right? We can also think about the idea of place and space, right? Place and space is an area of interest in communication because the physical location actually plays a really major role in how a message is delivered, right? It's not just the acoustics and the sound, it's also the history, the context, the significance, and the meaning that's shown in that location, right? For instance, if somebody is giving a speech in the middle of a crowded street about health and medicine, that's very different than doing so outside the front steps of Johns Hopkins University, right? And also another major question is a question of who the public is, right? In a world of the internet, of a lot of fragmented communication, of social media and who is using which social media outlets in which way, right? Whether or not you're using a social media outlet like Twitter that now apparently is going to be owned by Elon Musk, right? There's a lot of questions about how we engage with a larger public audience. We don't have the single public anymore, but we do have a lot of smaller groups that we might try to reach through our communication. For instance, a lot of campaigns surrounding COVID-19 have been targeted toward people who might be hesitant but interested in vaccination, right? Rather than people who do not want to be vaccinated or people who are already vaccinated, right? So targeted campaigns and addressing populations are important. So when we're talking about reaching the public through communication, I think kind of the major takeaway, the one thing that I want to make sure that you can remember coming out of this week is this idea that mass media, like larger scale communication, is both a blessing and a curse, right? It's this double-edged sword in terms of what benefits and drawbacks it provides and how we understand and think about a lot of health and science information, right? Mass media means that a message is circulated from like one person or maybe a smaller group of people into a very large number of people, right? The idea that something could be a tweet, a speech, like a TV show where the season or episode gets released or filmed, the usage of a magazine, right? I was involved in my high school newspaper and we used mass media to reach other students at our school. So those are all examples of how we utilize mass media to take a message to distribute to a wide audience. It's not necessarily personalized. So of course, that's television, which is super important to health and science because it's how we get a lot of our own information through commercials, direct to consumer advertising that we'll talk about in a minute, and so on. Radio is less popular now, although there's definitely been a bit of a renaissance with things such as podcasts, right? If you were like me and you got on the serial wave when that podcast was really popular, a lot of podcasts and radio will use advertisements, or there are also radio or podcasts that are focused on health or science related issues. For instance, one of my colleagues at Utah Tech University, where he was before here, has a podcast called Red Rock Relationships, where he talks about communication and communication theory as it relates to intimate partner relationships. It's kind of interesting. Obviously, the internet matters a lot, including social media. It's a big source of how we get information, as we talked about last week. Magazines, advertisements, etc. If it is circulated to a larger group, then it's a good example of mass communication. So the theories and ideas we'll be talking about today will be really kind of focused on that and focused on chapter 11 of Dupree. And then we'll be looking at the other articles, the piece related to mental health and the piece that I worked on with colleagues about how we convey health information to the public. So one core idea that I think is useful for us to think about as we're examining what it means to be influenced by mass media, because we are, whether or not we want to be, right? Mass media has played a role in how we think about it. For instance, if there is a particular illness or condition you are not personally familiar with, that you do not see in your family or friend relationships, there is a very good chance that what you think about and what you understand about that illness is based on media that you've been exposed to, right? For instance, maybe something such as dementia is depicted in television and film in a very specific way, oftentimes in a very stigmatizing way, right? But if you don't necessarily have a personal reference point, such as your own family, media representations are going to shape how you approach and think about that issue, what you have to draw from. So third person effect is important here because when we think about how media portrays and talks about health and science related issues, oftentimes we tend to think that we are not personally susceptible. We're not going to be impacted by those messages, but that other people will be, right? It's not me, it's that third person over there, right? Commercials will not affect my judgment, they'll only affect other people. And the idea is that because everybody thinks that, we are often unaware of how media does play a pretty big role in how we think about and approach these issues. I'll give you one example that connects pretty closely to Wednesday's class, and that is the trope of mental illness being associated with violence. Statistically, what we know is that people that are mentally ill are not necessarily people that are going to be more prone to being serial killers or being like incredibly violent or having higher rates of violent crime. There might be a greater need for support, there might be outbursts or issues that happen, but our association of mental illness with physical violence and threat has been one that has emerged much more because of media depictions than it has because of the actual material circumstances of people with mental illnesses. In this way, mass media plays a really big role in how we think about health and science-related issues. It's important for us, especially as we're cutting through the ideas that our patients might have if we're working as a professional or expert, to think about how media has shaped their approach and understanding of issues. For instance, when I talked to interviewees who identified as autistic, right, one thing that they shared was that disclosing and talking about autism in their own lives meant they had to dispel a lot of myths. They would say things like, look, I'm not like Rain Man, or I'm not like Sheldon Cooper from The Big Bang Theory, right? There are a lot of differences in my needs and support that are not being adequately represented online. So one idea that we've talked about, if you're in my communication theory class, might be new to you, is this idea of cultivation theory. Cultivation theory is developed and developed under the assumption that the more that we're exposed to media content, the more we believe in real life that it reflects what's on screen. In other words, if you have seen a show like NCIS, Criminal Minds, those like crime shows where there's typically a case of the week that the group has to solve, right? We know that those are heavily dramatized, that the way that they depict going through the court, the way that they depict forensics, the way that they have like a zoom in on a photo where there's no way the resolution zoomed in could look as good as it does on screen. Like all of those inaccuracies and issues are things that the more and more of those that we see, the more we start to think in real life that that's actually how forensics or how a criminal investigation goes. Even though we know that there are some problems and inaccuracies there, we nevertheless think it follows somewhat similarly, right? Another example here is a common example in mass media, the idea that if it leads, it leads, right? The idea that oftentimes news and journalism will depict stories that really highlight violence and discrimination on the basis that choosing to highlight those issues will lead to more viewers and attention, right? Because it's visceral, it's shocking, it's awful, and as a result, it gets attention. So in other words, this idea that media represents real life then means the ways that we think about health, what it means to be healthy, the stories we tell ourselves about health and about illness are in many ways a product of media that we're exposed to and that we think about. For instance, there is a lot of ways that representation, including the use of color, the use of body size, the use of physicality and physical expression and so on, is portrayed in children's entertainment, right? Like Disney films. We think about like villainous characters who are oftentimes depicted as having some type of mental illness, right? As being examples of cultivation theory too. For media to have a major role, though, it has to have a few things. First of all, it has to be consistent, right? That we have to consistently, on a regular basis, be exposed to particular messages. We're told over and over again, mental illness means violence. And because we get that frequent message in our heads, we start to believe that for ourselves. It's frequent, right? We get exposed to it a lot on a regular basis. And that we have to have a limited basis for evaluation or critique, right? If we are shown something that is blatantly false and inaccurate, of course, we're going to respond to it and say there's no way that this is real or that this is how this issue is actually being portrayed. However, if we don't have as much to go off of, or it's a topic or issue that we haven't really thought about outside of its depiction in media, then we're more likely to attribute it as accurate, right? If our only way of understanding what dementia is like is through watching it on TV, we have less space to critique and understand that its depiction might be really flawed and incorrect. Another idea here that goes back to the old phrase all the way from the 1920s, the idea of keeping up with the Joneses, or I guess up until very recently, right? Like the title Keeping Up with the Kardashians is a reference to this too. The idea that when we think about other families, other people, maybe people like our peers and friends, that there's a sort of rivalry happening where we're judging and comparing ourselves related to other people, right? And that's important too as we're thinking about health and science, because oftentimes when we're making decisions about our health and about what we should do every day, we're doing so on the basis of what we see other people as doing. For instance, if you're with a group of friends and your group of friends starts talking about how great going on a juice cleanse is and how, you know, they've been doing this cleansing and it's been awesome, then that might be something that pushes you to try that too. Or if you have a friend who will not stop talking about CrossFit, right? It's this idea of social pressure to try to get you to change your own behavior. So I think one important idea here that's, again, pointing to the double-edged sword nature of how we communicate to the public and use mass media is this idea of direct-to-consumer or DTC advertising. And again, this is kind of a weird one because we have seen it circulated and used so much that it's kind of become a joke and a meme in and of itself. And also, a lot of the way that direct-to-consumer advertising is happening now is a lot more tongue-in-cheek and ironic or silly, right? For instance, if you have ever seen like commercials or advertisements for things like Viagra or Cialis, right? These commercials are oftentimes very over the top. You know, there's a depiction of a romantic couple and a lot of questions about, you know, how that older couple could be supported through Viagra, right? An example of how advertising has become really pervasive and at times kind of silly, right? So DTC means that rather than the sort of historical approach where a medical professional is the person who says, hey, you should take this medication. I think this medication would be really good for you based on your symptoms. Here you go. Instead of the doctor or medical professional taking on that role, it's instead an advertiser using media to sort of leapfrog over the health professional, right? It means selling prescription drugs straight to consumers, using mass media rather than having the physicians to market and sell. So one example here is that the FDA, or the Food and Drug Administration, actually has a pretty big role to play in the regulation and management of DTC advertising, right? For instance, the reason that you hear all of the drawbacks of a drug that are shared in those commercials are because of the FDA. Were it not for that regulation, in fact, a lot of advertisements could just not share the side effects or negative aspects at all. So some of these things are designed as a safeguard to provide informed information. And oftentimes, people will bring up the advertisements that they see, including in DTC advertising, in order to show their knowledge or expertise in health-related issues. For instance, I know that you have Sjogren's disease. I actually saw this advertisement on TV for this medication. Have you tried taking it, right? Oftentimes, when we're exposed to media content through DTC, it leads to us thinking we have expertise in those areas and can share that information to other people. And then the last thing to think about is this idea that direct-to-consumer advertising is often involving competition, right? That you have companies such as Cialis and Viagra who are in competition with each other. You have different types of medication. Oftentimes you'll have like your Advil or ibuprofen. You'll have the like brand name or the generic brand that's typically a lot cheaper. So a lot of the direct consumer approach is operating under this very capitalistic approach to trying to compete, get people interested, and means that advertisers are incentivized to try to make their products seem perhaps unrealistically beneficial, right, in order to gain that attention and viewership. And as we've talked about, some of the ways that media depict some issues related to the side effects and ways of thinking about taking medications are kind of interesting. So I'll show you one example of direct-to-consumer advertising and some of the, I think, rather interesting ways that it has some of the drawbacks represented.
We know a place where tossing and turning have given way to sleeping, where sleepless nights yield to restful sleep, and Lunesta can help you get there, like it has for so many people before. When taking Lunesta, don't drive or operate machinery until you feel fully awake. Walking, eating, driving, or engaging in other activities while asleep without remembering it the next day have been reported. Abnormal behaviors may include aggressiveness, agitation, hallucinations, or confusion. In depressed patients, worsening of depression, including risk of suicide, may occur. Alcohol may increase these risks. Allergic reactions such as tongue or throat swelling occur rarely and may be fatal. Side effects may include unpleasant taste, headache, dizziness, and morning drowsiness. Ask your doctor if Lunesta is right for you. Then get Lunesta for $0 at lunesta.com. There's a land of restful sleep. We can help you go there.
So maybe there's a land of restful sleep, but there are a lot of side effects, worsening of depression, sleepwalking, all this stuff that's kind of concerning to see, right? So examples of advertisements like that depict an array of side effects and problems are actually examples of the FDA's requirement, meaning that that information be accurately shared. So direct-to-consumer advertising like this Lunesta ad are examples of the things that we pretty regularly see in mass communication about health, that it doesn't just come from providers, but that it can also come from manufacturers and people who have a business relationship to health and medicine. So as we talked about so far, while there are some benefits to DTC advertising, it can help to reach people who might need a specific care or support they might not be able to get if they can't regularly access a doctor. There are a lot of problems. One of the kind of concerning and interesting consequences is that the process of advertising and marketing for a lot of these medications and products means that the actual products are more expensive, right? Advertising budget and spending actually drives up the cost of medication, which shows some of the problems direct to consumer. One other concern, right, is this idea of correlating cost with quality, that not always are the more expensive medications the better ones. In fact, in a lot of circumstances, generic brand medicine is exactly the same quality as like a name brand one as well. But things like name recognition or advertising could cause the name brand one to be seen as better. So health professionals then worry that the higher priced ones are put on a pedestal and seen as the better options, and therefore could be a cost to consumers. Also, right, advertisements have become bolder in some of the claims and things that they say that you can do, right? For instance, showing the positive effects of a medication. The use of imagery sometimes for medication related to depression is interesting, like it's like dark, but suddenly there's a beam of light that pops up above somebody when they start taking the medication, right? When in reality, there might be some side effects and problems with taking that medication. And it's not just suddenly everything is amazing feeling when you do. Another concern here, right, is that kind of an interesting paradox is that while it's a good idea to focus on and be concerned with your health, that if you're too preoccupied or focused on your health to a negative degree, it can actually pose a risk, right, in terms of a financial risk or having so much focus on a healthy option through direct consumer advertising that it means somebody is choosing something that's ultimately damaging, untested, or untrustworthy. And then another thing to think about here is also to think about who is represented and talked about when we think about advertising and direct to consumer, right? One big factor again is thinking about cost. Sometimes these products are way too expensive and somebody thinks, well, I can't get the care of that. I can't get what I need when something like a copay might be available. Another problem might be that the way in which an advertisement depicts an issue might leave out or be inconsiderate of people from diverse perspectives. Historically, a lot of direct-to-consumer advertising has disproportionately depicted people who are white and male, right? So sometimes not including diverse perspectives in advertisements and direct-to-consumer can lead to a lot of people falling through the cracks. We can also think about this in terms of algorithms, right? Who is being covered or analyzed or focused on for some of these advertisements? That's a source of potential disparities too. So when it comes to looking at and evaluating the messages that we see as it relates to health and science issues, I think one important approach to take is to just take the wording of the advertisements that are given with a grain of salt, right? Oftentimes there are over the top or just completely incorrect ones. For instance, visiting Mars reduces heartburn, texting while driving is safe, right? Those things are clearly inaccurate. And so looking at the phrasing, for instance, a lot of times direct-to-consumer advertisers will use may as an effort to hedge their bets, right? And say, this medication may lead to positive impacts, but we're not going to commit to it being a good or a bad thing. Also, print sources can usually provide more detailed information, right? Direct-to-consumer is an advertisement that's trying to portray the medication in the best way that it can. But if you really read the fine print, right, you read something like a manual or read the dosage instructions, it'll usually provide more accurate information. And again, newer medicine does not always mean that medicine is better, especially if there is medicine that has been proven to be effective at combating or addressing a particular condition. For instance, right, insulin continues to be effective for people who are diabetic. One way that oftentimes people are swindled is by saying, look at this new medicine that's usually the exact same or hasn't been properly tested. So I'm going to split you into two groups. And what I'd like each group to do is to take some time to look at direct-to-consumer advertisements. Again, I showed a couple examples like the usage of commercials for things such as Lunesta or Viagra, right? But look for some examples on your own for medical products. It could be social media ads, commercials, or anything else. And then as you're looking through and talking about this among your group, I want you to pay attention to whether or not you believe that these ads are depicting these medications in a balanced or accurate way. And then lastly, based on what you're noticing, what might be some of the ethical concerns related to these advertisements, including potential sources of inaccuracies or misinformation. So it looks like we've got 3, 4, 5. So let's do 1, 2, 3, and 4. Then let's do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Oh, that's lopsided with it. Sorry, let's start that over. 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And then 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So we'll have each of the groups take some time to work on it, and then we'll chat about your responses here in just a little bit. I like the Mucinex thing where it was old drones that look like David Leo. Yeah.
Did you ever see the Primal Set commercials for Claire the Cable?
Oh, I've heard about those. Yeah, yeah. It's interesting how like celebrity or like casting will play a big role in everything. Like we attribute like credibility to medications that we have. Oh, yeah. Some of these are actually racist. Give you about 2 or 3 more minutes to continue to look at this. Go ahead and wrap up. Heard some interesting things from both groups so far. All right. So why don't we go ahead and hear from the group in the front first, some of the examples that they saw, and then what they noticed about how they were portrayed and maybe some concerns they had about this.
So some of the
Mhm.
and then we said that we acted on the grade balance,
Mhm.
and that in the ads they make it seem like the product will solve the issue,
Mhm.
and the side effects are mostly like discussed like in a very fast like speed, and
Mhm.
it is usually played over like a good like hack to see how like the product actually working for that person.
Mhm.
And then for number three, that they don't make some of the side effects like understandable,
Mhm.
and they also downplay issues. And then in some ads, it's not the actual consumer, it's like the product speaking, but it's actually actors.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, So these are some really good observations, right? Oftentimes when we see commercials, they'll say like actor portrayal as they're talking about all the benefits that the medication had, right? Which can be really misleading if you don't read the fine print. Also thinking back to health literacy, right? The idea that they're just speeding through the side effects, and the side effects are also being delivered in super heavy medicalized use of language that we don't know what the side effects mean or what they do. I think that's a really good point as well. So even if information is depicted according to the rules in a lot of these advertisements, that there are a lot of ways that companies try to get around it or don't present information as openly as they might otherwise be recommended to do. Let's hear from the group back here. Yeah, these are good, some good observations there. Billboards are a really good example, right? There's a lot of ways that visual advertisements show up in ways you don't expect. Billboards or like, you pull out a shopping cart and there's the little sleeve where there's an advertisement that comes up to. There's a lot of ways that visual advertisements appear when we don't expect it, but still can contribute to health messages. Social media, I like the idea that people can participate and offer input and feedback. In fact, oftentimes, as was brought up last week, using something like Reddit can actually allow for like people to express their opinions or Google reviews in a way that goes outside of the bias we might see in a lot of advertisements or other depictions. But again, there's ethical concerns here too about the accuracy of information, the question of whether or not you're a good candidate, right? Sometimes when people see an advertisement for like an antidepressant, they might think, oh, this would be great for me. But then they talk to a provider and find out that because of other medications, that those medications would not be good together, right? So that's one of the challenges, is thinking about whether or not you're a good candidate based on expertise. A couple other things that I think are important to think about too are, first of all, that it's not just for medication. In fact, it's been interesting to see a lot of food and drink move toward advertising certain health benefits. For instance, the use of a lot of like fad types of foods as purporting health benefits, like kale or acai, which might have some positive health elements, but when they're marketed or advertised based on their health benefits, that can be kind of interesting. Or the use of electrolytes or something being prebiotic, right, are being used to almost market health solutions for things that might not be that big of a difference, right? Oftentimes, again, advertisers are incentivized to make the health benefits as blown up and over the top as possible in order to market their products. So some good observations here. Let's go ahead and take a break, and we'll come back at about 3:03 or so to continue on in talking about how we use media to communicate to the public. Okay. Looks like we've got everybody back. So let's pick up where we left off here in talking about some of the ways that media communicate about health and science to the public. During our break, I opened a soda and it says that it supports digestive health, prebiotics, botanicals, and plant fiber. An example of how the way that health has been advertised is not just about pharmaceuticals and direct medication, but also impacts the supposed health benefits of food and drink, right? So these are important things for us to continue to explore when we look more broadly at how health is conveyed. So continuing on where we left off, I want to talk a little bit more, not just about the ways in which media advertises, but also the way in which health is represented in thinking about what it means to be healthy or to, have a healthy body or to think about how we compare ourselves to media. I'm going to share a brief clip from Peter Conrad, who is an author of a book known as Medicalization of Society, comes in from a sort of social scientific perspective in understanding some of the ways that we communicate about and engage in issues related to health, right? And I think offers an important contribution to some of the challenges about the ways that issues have been framed as topics of health versus topics of human difference.
Please join me in welcoming Professor Peter Conrad.
Just to graduate students, I want to say one word about this era. I'm probably have written more about ADHD and medicalization than I've written about other things, and especially about medicalization. When I was writing my dissertation, which was about ADHD, then called hyperactive children, when I wrote my dissertation proposal, it had the really, really boring title of Factors in the Identification of Hyperactive Children. This was 1974 or 73 when I wrote my dissertation proposal. It didn't mention the word medicalization anywhere. In fact, I'd never heard of it. And then I went out and started collecting data, and I started to see. I was doing research in a major pediatric hospital. I was interviewing a lot of parents, mostly mothers, about their children. And at that time, I could actually look at school records, or school referrals, actually, to the program. You couldn't do that now. To see why people thought that these kids needed to come here for these behavior problems that weren't obviously medical problems, or at least weren't medical problems in the traditional way this major pediatric hospital dealt with medical problems. That being said, it was only halfway through writing my dissertation that I read an article by Irving Zola called Medicine as an Institution of Social Control, and learned about this term that he used there, and not a lot of people have talked about, called medicalization. I said, oh my God, that's what I'm studying. And that's what I've been studying. Talk about medicalization. Let's all get on the same page. It really is simple. It means to make medical. I used to have to explain to people what it is. You don't have to explain to people anymore. Everybody sort of gets it now, because it's happened. When I started studying it, it was on the edge of sociology, on the edge of the world. People didn't necessarily think about that. Now you talk about medicalization. Some people still say, well, what does that mean? You explain to them, it means to make medical of some things that weren't medical. And give them a few examples. They all get it.
So, right. So Conrad's perspective is that medicalization is what is referred to as taking what are not necessarily medical problems and framing or treating them as such, right? Not to say that ADHD is not real, it absolutely is, but to say that there were a disproportionate number of children from the 70s and 80s who were brought forth, right, to receive medical intervention for issues, including potential false diagnosis of ADHD, when there were behavioral and social factors that went into why the children were acting the way that they did, that weren't really being examined or addressed. And by only treating it as a medical problem, it was ignoring the ways that social and cultural factors were shaping the behavior of children in the area. For instance, maybe not having regular access to physical activity, recess, outdoors, not having activities that are engaging enough for young children, right? Those could all have been factors that contributed to what we're seeing as behavioral issues that were treated as medical problems. Another example has been the emergence of the term andropause to describe people assigned male at birth related to associated conditions with aging. For instance, losing hair, obviously issues related to sexuality and sexual performance, right? And related topics got put into this term andropause to describe that experience. And therefore, a lot of companies, for instance, companies for hair restoration and similar procedures got to say, we're using this to combat andropause, right? Sort of as this contrast to menopause, right? So that's another example of some of the ways that medicalization has occurred. Again, it's not to say that there are issues that should be recognized or understood or treated as medical problems, but that when issues are always framed in a medical way, even when there are non-medical elements to them, that it ignores some of those non-medical elements and makes it seem as if a medical solution is the only way to resolve the problem, right? If a child is being too active, then just give them Prozac, right? Is not a good solution in every single situation. So as we think about then how media talks about and represents health, in addition to medicalization, I think it's useful to think about how health is depicted, right? Because when there are unrealistic depictions of health in media, it can have some really serious and potentially life-threatening consequences. In fact, the way in which very thin body types and frames are treated as an ideal, right, or how somebody should be healthy or sexually attractive, when that gets framed really positively, it's led to and contributed to serious factors, including depression and negative mental health, but has also been a contributing factor to things such as eating disorders like anorexia and bulimia. In fact, many ways media depiction of the ideal body type or frame as incredibly thin has led to death from associated disorders and methods of trying to reach what media tells us is that ideal body, right? And while we thankfully have seen, I think, more positivity and frames outside of this one body type, it's still, I think, a history and context that's challenged, right? That unrealistic depictions of what it means to be healthy can create pressure, and especially in teenagers and young adults, right, can really contribute to negative health impacts. Additionally, this idea of continuing to focus on physical appearance, even if it has negative impacts on somebody's health, is another issue to think about too. For example, there are a lot of circumstances in which performing a plastic surgery or surgical procedure could be incredibly dangerous or damaging, but there might be this really strong desire to do it at any cost. Additionally, one problem that we've seen, although I think we've overall seen it a bit less, have been advertisements for products that might be potentially dangerous or harmful, right? Such as depictions of alcohol that are targeted toward a younger population. The way in which commercials and advertisements are marketed on specific channels or programs that might be for kids, but advertise things like alcohol can definitely be a big problem. And in addition to some of these ideals, like you look at, who's on the front cover of something like Cosmopolitan, right? And it's typically a thin, body type. But we also see a lot of concerns with the use of exaggerated and sensational stories about health, right? For instance, a lot of times there are these kind of pop culture pieces, and attention is dedicated toward health issues that are sensational, but aren't necessarily healthy or engaged with current events or issues. For instance, a number of years ago, there was media obsession with Octomom, right? A mother that was having 8 kids. And the way in which, there is this amazing medical treatment, as we've talked about, that might turn out to be just a regular generic drug, are examples of how media might depict things in a pretty inaccurate way. So when it comes to parsing out and trying to sift through media sources to determine what is credible, some of the methods of doing so, I think, are good strategies. First of all, picking the factual over the sensational. Just because a story is popular does not necessarily mean that a story is accurate or a story is very good for somebody's health or well-being, right? If somebody says that there is a new miracle treatment for COVID-19, then you should take that with a grain of salt, because that source might not be accurate. Speaking of COVID-19, right, another concern is that because of the way the media cycle runs, because of the popularity and circulation of news articles and pieces, that there's concern about issues fading from popularity and fading from coverage. For instance, right, COVID-19 continues to have serious impacts on the global population, even though it's received comparatively less coverage in recent weeks compared to other issues, for instance, Russia and Ukraine, right? Or if we think about ongoing issues impacting health disparities, for example, neglected tropical diseases, or looking at health disparities in childbirth and pain management, those are topics that continue to be important, but don't necessarily receive regular news coverage and attention. So thinking about issue framing and selection, I think is an important grain of salt to take as well. Never rely on one source, right? So one thing that I love to do whenever I'm checking the news, right, is I go on, I see what NBC and CNN and Fox and all of them have to say. And it's interesting to pay attention to what the different topics and issues are depending on the source and its potential bias, right? So thinking about multiple sources and the way that these multiple sources depict issues is a useful strategy too. And then lastly, setting the record straight, right? So for instance, if you have an older relative who sends you a factually incorrect article about a treatment that can cure cancer, right? I think it's a socially responsible and beneficial thing to do to identify and pay attention to some of the ways in which information might not be accurate. There's also, as we've talked about last week, an issue related to the publication process, the idea of a preprint, right? A preprint being an article that has not been through peer review and gone through all the steps necessary for publication and is still in a working state. So taking preprints carefully and recognizing that they cannot be interpreted as fact necessarily is another useful strategy. So we'll pick more up on this on Wednesday, but I do want to highlight some of the challenges related to how media distort and inaccurately talk about issues in health, right? As I mentioned, one really prominent example here is depiction of mental health and mental illness, right? How many people, has anybody seen the movie Split? Heard of it? Yeah. Right. So in this movie, James McAvoy is playing a character who has multiple personality disorder, and the idea is that he has all of these personalities that behave really differently, but there's this one personality that's this like incredibly violent, sadistic, terrible person, right? And for people that manage mental illness, including related conditions like this one, that is not how that works out, right? And for a lot of us, we might say, yeah, of course, that's not how mental illness actually works. It's not like everybody has an evil personality that they're trying to suppress, right? But not everybody necessarily feels the same way. They don't have the same exposure to mental illness or related issues and might think this is an accurate depiction. Or even though we understand that, you know, people with mental illness or people who negotiate multiple personalities don't necessarily have an evil personality, it's still a negative depiction of mental illness. It still portrays somebody with mental illness as dangerous, as threatening, as deviant, and in so doing, perpetuates negative stereotypes related to mental illness and related issues, right? So the idea here is that oftentimes the portrayal of disability and mental illness tends to be as violent or dangerous. Look out, this 24th personality is going to come out and get you, right? As an example of some of the problems here. And again, we can think about other representations. For instance, the way in which oftentimes serial killers are depicted as sociopathic, as other instances of illness and its associated stereotypes. Another model that I think is another important thing to think about is this idea of infantilization, right? Of treating somebody as if they're like a little kid. That model in portraying disability or aging sort of prevalent in both of them, right? For instance, there's a lot of examples in film where, you know, there's a cute old person, you know, who just, you know, is just adorable and says silly things, or, you know, portrayal of a very young child, right? So Tiny Tim in Christmas Carol is an example of this, right? It's a very infantilized approach toward portraying disability. Additionally, there's also what's known as the charity model, right? The idea that supporting disability is not necessarily about the actual person with the disability, but that it makes the donor or person feel good and makes it about them, right? For instance, in a lot of discussions surrounding disability, there is pushback against parents who are not necessarily supporting the person, but using like their child with a disability in a way that could be seen as not caring about them specifically, but making it about the parent, right? Not to say the parents don't encounter significant challenges related to disability in raising a child with a disability, but to say that sometimes there's a risk that the representation of the parent can overshadow the challenges that the child is experiencing. Additionally, there are, of course, changes in how we depict a lot of forms of media. One of them being that, yes, over recent decades, there has been increased representation of sex in film and TV, right? Anybody who has had an HBO subscription knows that that representation has gone up. But by comparison, there's significantly less discussion, depiction, and representation surrounding safe sex and surrounding sort of sexual health practices. It's been interesting, though, to see that that has actually shifted a lot in recent years. A couple examples that come to mind are the TV shows Sex Education and Big Mouth on Netflix that both try to depict sexual health, puberty, and related issues, and try to do so in sort of a edutainment, informative, and educational in the same way type of frame. So that type of approach has definitely had some changes in recent years. And then there is an ongoing discussion and debate about whether or not depictions of violence in media actually translate to or lead to violence in groups, right? And one area that that's gained considerable attention has been in the context of video games, right? And some that contend that video games cause violence, encourage violent behavior, others that have found that there's no link between the two, and even some that have found that gaming can be cathartic and can actually decrease violence and related behavior. So a lot of discussion and disagreement surrounding some of the health consequences of media. So there's also issues surrounding how media might choose to educate or make us aware of health-related issues as well. One really major example of this, of how health and related messages are conveyed, is the use of product placement, right? So if you watch a show on Netflix, I think it's gotten more and more blatant over the years, right? Like on Stranger Things, they're holding a new Coke. I think Coca-Cola actually like put new Coke back on the market to correspond to a release of a new Stranger Things season. So there's a lot of examples of how product placement is happening to convey our information. But this circles back to this idea of social adaptation theory, that we evaluate and use mediated information based on its relevance to our own lives, right? And this is why algorithmically targeted advertisements have gotten especially clever and insidious, right? Where they they look at your search history, they maybe overhear some of the things that you're talking about if you have like a microphone, right? And they start to generate advertisements based on the things that they think appeal to you specifically. So targeted ads are ways that social adaptation theory attempts to be used. But it's the idea that maybe we're looking at antidepressants and we see a commercial for an antidepressant and think, maybe this could be a fit for me. So some of the ways that education ties to media representation, first of all, is the use of an entertainomercial, right? Which are essentially the use of sales pitches or advertisements that resemble like an entertainment programming or TV show. If you've ever seen, for instance, something like a very special episode, right, or an episode of a TV show where they choose to tackle and talk about a specific issue, this is really popular in the 90s and early 2000s. For instance, maybe an episode of a TV show suddenly has an episode about drunk driving and all of that. It's an example of trying to advertise or convey information despite using an entertainment medium. Additionally, entertainment education is about using entertainment as a medium in order to convey health-related information. Again, I think TV shows like Sex Education or Big Mouth are examples of using like the structure of a TV show to try to convey health information. And then education entertainment is kind of the other way around. It's using media to educate through education. And then as mentioned, there's also product placement, which can also play a role in its depiction of interventions in support of health. For instance, oftentimes we'll have somebody who goes on an exercise regimen or has a plastic surgery done, and all of a sudden they're seen as incredibly attractive, right? As an example of how portrayals of health are represented in media. And then one of the last points that I wanted to get at for today is this idea of media literacy, right? The idea that for us, as we're thinking about and negotiating media, that we are really kind of constantly thinking about and analyzing whether or not that media is meaningful and makes sense to us, right? Earlier, when I asked you to think about the direct consumer advertisements, it's an example of media literacy, right? Of showing that you understand and can evaluate and judge messages that are being conveyed about health. At the informative stage, we're learning what those messages are. What are people saying about health and how does that impact our lives? In our analytics stage, we're discussing how we make sense of those messages. For instance, as you all pointed out, billboards might not be especially specific or might have skewed information, or maybe a commercial is just speeding through the negative side effects without really explaining them. Deconstructing is breaking down the message, right? The message says this is good for your health. There are some side effects, but don't worry about those because they just go through those really quickly. And then at the experiential stage, we're developing new content or new information to understand the media process. We understand that a lot of companies are incentivized to downplay the negative side effects because it sells more products, right? And that idea of developing good media literacy and thinking about health and science is also a useful strategy for parents, right? Or older siblings or caretakers who are put in a position where, because children can be especially influenced by media messages, can help to break those things down, right? A kid sees an advertisement and says, hey, look, mom, these fruit gushers are really good. And it says that they have real fruit juice. And the parent has to sit down and say, yes, but this has a lot of sugar, not very healthy, it's a special occasion, right? And explaining how the media message, despite advertising 100% juice, is not really healthy. So mediation can play a really big role in helping us to develop that media literacy. So I want you to return to your groups from earlier. And as part 2 for your attendance for today, I'd like you all to take some time to talk about what the ideal body media tells us is, and whether or not you feel like that ideal body type has changed in recent years at all. But what are the messages that you've received related to that? And then to think about what some of the consequences of how media depicts this ideal body or way to be look like. And then lastly, I want you to think about, given what we've talked about with media literacy, how media literacy might respond to some of those messages. So take some time to think a little bit about this, about what some of these common messages are, and some of the ways that we might respond constructively to those messages. I'll give you around 10 minutes or so to think through this.
Old Spice. Yeah.
Think about 5 more minutes.
That's like looking.
About 2 more minutes. So go ahead and wrap up for a thought or idea. So let's chat a little bit about this, starting here on this side. What did you all notice about like the ideal body, the way it's depicted, and how we might respond immediately?
Muscular, normal height, and then you can also and that's a few
Then come up here on this side. Feel free to share all three.
So for the first one, we said that like media has been better at like promoting that there is no ideal body, but still kind of has like a criteria. So for men, we said like that they need to be muscular. Women should have like a not should have, but it's promoted that they have small waist, big boobs, and big butt. And then like we also mentioned that like older people should like still have hair. And then there's always like one quality that is considered that is like unattainable. And then for the second one, some of the consequences is that it promotes unrealistic expectations for others and for yourself. And then for the third one, we said that it can be used to help with explaining what the message is actually saying and make it easier to understand. And media literacy, you are able to identify what ways the message exaggerates things. And you can also look up data to get a better understanding and to discredit what is being promoted.
Yeah. So in hearing from both groups, I think there's some really good points here that connect pretty well to ways of thinking about health in media and culture, right? As you all brought up here on this side, some of the challenges of gendered depictions of an ideal body type, I think play a really big role. There, of course, are what can feel like a double standard. I've heard, some people were saying that oftentimes, right, the way that men are depicted, it's a lot more lenient in terms of what physical appearance could be, right? That being heavier, right, or having a larger frame is seen as more acceptable, or even sort of treated in a sexually positive way. And that can be one challenge related to media representation. I also liked on this side, you all were talking about sort of the portrayal of skin color, right? One challenge that has come up in recent years has been a discussion not only related to race and racism, and obviously the challenges that come in things such as, usage of blackface or characters who are white or whitewashing, but also the idea of colorism, right? The way in which media portrayals of people of color as like very light-skinned and disproportionately representing light-skinned populations as more ideal, right, is another challenge and a way in which media depictions have contributed to stigma and problems, right? And there have been campaigns and efforts to combat that as well. And some of the ways, again, that these kinds of expectations can have significant risks and challenge, right? Of an ideal body type that's unrealistic or contributes to health problems or preoccupation that could reinforce disparities and lack of access to support. So all important considerations for us to bring in thinking about the challenges of how people are depicted in media and the way in which there might be greater diversity of perspectives or body types, but even those, as you all brought up here, fit within a specific frame and so on. One thing I should bring up too before we wrap up is that the usage of social media, in particular, the usage of apps such as TikTok has brought with it a lot of changes in using media to convey and talk about issues including mental health. For instance, the usage of disability-related TikTok. For instance, people talking about mental health and disability has oftentimes been a source of comfort and support and solidarity, and are actually providing practical tips, but can, of course, like all other outlets, be a source of misinformation and expertise that doesn't necessarily come from a medical professional too. So it's another addition and wrinkle to this ever-changing terrain. So to wrap up our key points for today's class, we were talking about how we communicate health and science to the public through the use of mass media and representations, including the use of television and advertisements, this direct-to-consumer messaging that oftentimes cuts the role of a physician or makes it a lot more challenging to make sure that accurate information is being conveyed. And also that how media represents health, what the ideal body or the types of bodies being represented look like, can be major factors in terms of health and social support. That whether we want to or not, we're oftentimes subconsciously comparing ourselves to what we perceive as the ideal way to be, and in doing so, that can contribute to risks and challenges related to our own health. So for next class, we'll be looking at a piece that talks about how mental illness and health is portrayed in media. I think this is a useful piece in exploring some of the challenges and consequences of skewed framing of health-related issues. And then we'll be looking at a piece related to how public initiatives attempt to reach the public, including the way that things such as science and scientific history are shared. So there'll be some important things that we'll be able to pick up on there as well. So please pass forward your group's work for the day and make sure that your names are on it. Have a great rest of your afternoon, and I will see you again for Wednesday's class.